Hello, everyone, and welcome to our exciting webinar, Unveiling the Mind and Harnessing Neuroscience for Enhanced Safety, which is presented by myosh in collaboration with the wonderful Cristian from HabitSafe. My name is Christina, and I am the Operations Consultant here at myosh, and today we are diving into the fascinating world of neuroscience and its pivotal role in improving workplace safety. Cristian is going to take us on a journey into how neuroscience enables us to see inside the brain and understand human behaviour by answering many questions that have been asked on this topic to both him, myself, and everybody in between. Today's webinar will be recorded, and we really encourage you all to participate actively throughout the webinar. Feel free to ask questions, share your thoughts, engage with the discussion. Your insights and experiences are invaluable, and we look forward to a lively and interactive session with you all. So thank you all for joining us today. Let's get started on this journey into the mind and discover how we can harness the power of neuroscience to create safer workplaces. So Cristian, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself and do a bit of a background on HabitSafe, and then we'll kick off with the questions.
Okay, thanks, Christina, and thanks people for joining us. Look, HabitSafe sort of was born out of some work that I did earlier on. I used to work for Shell and as a process safety engineer, so very much on the side of stopping a refinery blowing up and a nuclear reactor from melting down. People these days talk about safety. Yes, people talk about safety. Safety means a lot of things. I tend to see it as a spectrum. On one end is process safety, sort of stuff that I used to work on, HAZOPs and bow tie diagrams and event trees, that kind of stuff, very technical sort of safety. And on the other side, there's personal safety or occupational safety. Now, as I was working as a process safety engineer, the refinery that I was working at had the worst personal safety record in the Shell world. Right? And because it was always had a reputation of being rather analytical and looking at the world from a different perspective, the refinery manager said to me, Cristian, can you have a look at our incidents? How are they different? Now, what is it that we're missing? We seem to be doing all the right things, but we still are worse than anybody else. So I started looking into that, and I sort of looked at the things that people normally did for safety. Like, we were really good at eliminating hazards. We were really good at providing the best controls that we could. We were also talking about safety with the people all the time. So there was leadership, commitment, and people that worked for Shell were enabling safety rather than disabling it. So I scratched my head and sort of started looking from a different perspective. And the thing that I found that all of our incidents had was some sort of level of inattention. So this was in the 1990s. So I presented this to the management team. They scratched their heads and said, well, what do you think we need to do? And I said, well, I think we should go out there and tell people to be more attentive and be more careful. And of course, that had no impact whatsoever at all. And then I kind of left Shell, but I kept coming up with lots of incidents in the rest of my career that involved a considerable amount of inattention. So HabitSafe was born out of my curiosity, I guess, of what causes inattention. And we also want to teach people how to be more attentive, because if they're more attentive, they're much more likely to see what can hurt them early. And if you can see it, then you can avoid it. So one of the things that we talk to people about is if you look, you see, if you see, you can avoid. You can't avoid if you don't see, and you cannot see unless you look. So one of the things that we talk to people about is, you need to look before you move. If things are moving around you, you also need to look for the line of fire. Those are the main two habits that we teach people. And since then, we've done a lot of work, and what we have found is that if we put all the process safety stuff aside, for personal safety or occupational safety, more than 95% of incidents have some level of inattention involved. Now, 100% of the time there is a hazard. So if you can do something about a hazard, that's great. But people tend to do things that they've done plenty of times before. So because that's the case, they tend to do it in autopilot, and they don't really think about what can potentially hurt me. So what we do, so what we do is we try and plug the gap, I guess. We're not against anything else that people do for safety. We're saying there's this other aspect of it, which is about inattention, that also needs to get some airing.
Right. So I guess that sort of takes us to my first question, and that's basically what got you interested in neuroscience.
So what we found when we started talking about inattention, we started looking at it more closely, and I did this sort of at the early 2000s, there wasn't very much around. And certainly neuroscience did have the technology to look inside people's heads at the time, but they were more concerned about abnormal kind of things. Right? So does somebody with ADHD have a different way by which their brain functions than a normal person? It wasn't until about 2008, 2009 that I started seeing research about sort of how normal brains work. And when we started talking, when we started reading that and we started talking to people and we're asking, we asked people in incident investigations, for instance, what we would do is we were interested in what was going on with the person. So the things that we did is we, rather than incident investigation being part of the formal process, we would separate the two. We would say, hey, listen, we know about the incident. We've done an incident investigation. The organisation has come up with these corrective actions. That's finished. I now want to talk to you about what was going on with you. And what we would ask is what was different about this time? And what we started getting is we started getting things like rushing, frustration, fatigue, and complacency over and over and over again. So what HabitSafe did is it said, okay, so let's look at the neuroscience and what does it tell us about why people get in a rush? Why do they get frustrated? What happens when people get fatigued and what happens when people do things in autopilot and perhaps complacent? So research started coming out that not only explain why we do that, but it also explained ways by which we could help people do less of it. And that's really where the neuroscience sort of interest for me started. My interest, I guess, is, I want to understand why people do what they do. And for the last 40 or 50 years, in safety at least, and probably in other areas too, we've made an assumption. And that assumption is that if people know, they will make the right conscious decision not to get hurt. I wish that was true, right? I wish that was true. But the problem is that the brain doesn't work like that. And the reason why we think like that is because, it feels like everything is conscious.
I was going to say, what does neuroscience have that enables us to see inside the brain?
So what it has is it has a functional MRI. So most people are familiar with an MRI, like it's a picture, right? So I've got, dicky knee, I go to my doctor, he takes a picture, he goes, you've got fluid in your knee, this is what we need to do. A functional MRI is not a picture, it actually maps blood flow as it happens. So you can put somebody into a functional MRI, you can show them a photo of a snake and their amygdala lights up like a Christmas tree because that's where we register threats. Okay, so that was a good piece of discovery. But what we also discovered was when people feel threatened, blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, the bit here behind the forehead that regulates behavior, that diminishes. Not to the point where the brain cells die, but to the points where the brain cells have enough blood in order to continue to live, but not enough to function. Essentially, putting your ability to regulate your behavior to the side. So when people feel threatened, what do? They lash out. Why? Because they're finding it more difficult depending on the level of threat and how much blood didn't get to the prefrontal cortex. They're not able to use those brain cells in order to regulate their behavior. So they do things that they, in hindsight, probably wouldn't want to admit that it was them that actually did them. What we're finding out, so for the first time in human history, what we now sort of are seeing, we're actually able to see what's going on inside people's heads as it happens. It's a real game changer. And for me, the biggest lessons is the assumptions that were made in the past about what drives behavior are incomplete. They're limited by the outside in kind of view that we had before we had these kind of tools. Now we can get an inside out view and we can work with people so that they can actually sort of manage these subconscious brain modes, impatient, fatigue and complacent, better than what they were in the past.
And how do the conscious and the subconscious minds process and perceive risk?
Perceive risk. So risk is a funny term, right? Because I've gone back into history history, and the first time that we used the word risk was in the 1500s. The Medici family in Italy, and they would lend money out. And what they would do is they would assign risk depending on what the likelihood was of getting the money back. And if there was a low likelihood of getting the money back, they would give them a high interest rate. That's how they manage the whole sort of money lending process. So if you think about the evolution of human beings, and that's been going on for God knows how long, but say so a brain 100,000 years ago, which is essentially much like the brain we have today, they had no concept of risk. So the subconscious, so risk is very conscious. It's a construct that we've made up. It's useful to prioritize and to plan. But behavior is not driven by risk. Behavior is driven by sense of danger. So if you've done something 100 times before, nothing bad's ever happened, there's a neural circuit in your head and you're going to do it automatically. I have this conversation with people that text and drive all the time. I go, do you know it's illegal? I go, yeah. Do you know that it increases risk? And some of them go, I've read the report, it increases risk by 5 times or whatever it is. I said, why do you do it? They go, because nothing's ever happened. So we justify, so if you think about the brain and how behavior comes to the forefront, is that your brain, the first thing that it does is whenever it gets put into a situation, is it says, what is this most like? Have I done it before, and has it been a good outcome? If the answer to that is yes, then I'm going to predict that it's going to be a good outcome next time. So I'm going to allow it to happen. So from a neuroscience perspective, there's lots of behaviors that originate in the subconscious. They get fed to the conscious mind at the last second. Right. So as soon as we become aware, and because the behavior is it's very close to when we became aware, everything feels like a conscious decision. But most of it is already happened beforehand. Now, there's an interesting video with Marcus de Sortoy, who's a mathematician, and he was very interested in finding out what makes him good at solving mathematical problems, right? So he went to Germany, stuck his head in a functional MRI, right? And they said to him, listen, how you solve mathematical problems is a bit difficult. What we're going to do is something really simple. We're going to give you 2 buttons, right? You're going to think every 30 seconds, you're going to make a decision about which button you're going to press. We're going to register that. But before you press the button, we're going to measure your brain and we're going to see if we can predict which one you're going to press. Now, I'll spoil it for you. They could tell which button he was going to press before he pressed it. But by how long? Would you think it was less than a second, more than a second? What would your guess be, Christina?
I'm going to say less.
Okay, so you can get the paper out, right? And for most people, they can predict 11 seconds before they're going to press the button which way they're going to go, right? So there's a whole bunch of stuff happening in the background that we're not aware of that's determining what we're going to do, but we only become aware when it hits our conscious mind, which is the last step before the behavior happens, right? So if it happens with a basic decision, which people may think, oh, it's got to be a conscious choice, he chooses whether to go left or right, but there's a whole bunch of stuff going on behind the scenes that is shaping that before it actually reaches the conscious mind. Then what neuroscience is showing from a safety perspective is that there's a whole bunch of stuff that shapes your behavior before it hits your conscious mind, right? And by the time it hits the conscious mind, you may think it's a conscious decision because it feels that way, but the neuroscience is clear. It's happened 6, 7, 8 seconds before.
So I guess what neuroscience has sort of discovered about people's behavior is understanding why people do what they do, and especially when it comes to safety.
Yeah. So my interest is that, I guess it goes back to what my dad used to tell me, and he had these wonderful sayings. At the time, I thought, he's nuts. What's he talking to me about? The same sayings I use with my children, and they're probably having exactly the same thoughts that I had about my dad. And one of them was, life's hard and it's not always fair. So, learn to deal with whatever it throws at you. If something makes you feel bad or uncomfortable, that is the universe telling you you have something to learn. Okay? So I've always had this view of inside out. right? Not outside in.
Right.
Now, I kind of get, and we immigrated to Australia when I was 9 years old. My mum used to send me off to school with the salami sandwiches, right? And there were lots of Aussies there. And of course, I used to get picked on and punched and all that sort of stuff, but I used to like the salami sandwiches. So
So it was worth it.
those. But I learned to deal with people not being nice to me, right? And that's the thing about when you have an inside-out view of life, you kind of find ways to deal with the world when it doesn't do what you want it to do, right? Whereas I think that the trend at the moment is that people, especially with how offended people get, is that the world shall mold itself around me so I don't get offended. But if you think about it, the offence happens in people's heads. So, we have what we do is we talk to people about the fact that they can have some control over what happens to them. They can have some control over their safety. Now, I'm not against going around doing things around the person. Sure, get rid of the hazards. Sure, provide better controls. Talk to people about how important safety is. But if you look at the neuroscience and you begin to understand that 95% of your behavior originates in the subconscious, and in safety, when ignoring that, why is that? Why aren't we using, it makes sense to me to use everything at our disposal. So sure, continue to do things around the person, continue to talk to people about how important safety is, but we need a whole of brain approach if you want to help the person control what happens to them more than just allowing the world to do things to them.
Right. So I guess like lots of people, probably most of us, there's an illusion that we can control everything we do in a conscious manner.
Yeah.
But according to neuroscience, it's more likely the subconscious that influences what we do most.
Correct. So if you think, so there's examples of this, right? If you think of new technology, right, in cars, for instance.
Yeah.
Right? So I don't really go to conferences and listen to most people that speak because it's the same thing. It's like it's the same medicine, different bottle kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Like I've been to enough things and people just sort of regurgitate the same thing but in a slightly different context. But I did go and see this guy who actually works with insurance companies, right? And I was interested because I'm not just interested in safety at work. I'm interested in safety everywhere.
Yeah,
right?
as a whole.
Once you start looking at how incidents happen outside of work, you get a different perspective on what you can do in order to prevent them. So if you just look at safety at work, which is what safety does, you tend to get a view that kind of limits some of the things, right? You overemphasize certain things that underemphasize others, right? So anyway, I go along, and what he's saying that what they do is people sort of sign on to the app for the insurance company, and because they're on their phone, they can actually download information about the way in which they drive. Now, they can't use it specifically to target any particular person, but they use it in order to understand the trends. And they said, and this is the main trend. Over the last 10 years, we're not driving any faster, right? But what we're doing is speed at impact has increased by 10 miles per hour, 16 kilometers per hour. Right? So we're not driving any faster. Right? There's no difference in how fast we're driving. But when we hit something, we're hitting it at 16 kilometers per hour harder, faster.
Is that because we're noticing things too late because we're being inattentive?
Well, what he says is reaction time is increasing, right? And when you hit something 16 kilometers per hour, faster, you cause a lot more damage.
Yeah.
Right? And it's saying so fatalities on the road are going up. 2022 was the highest fatality rate for pedestrians ever, right?
So, is that because we're all on our phones with our heads down?
Yeah. So what he's saying is that the reaction time is getting longer. And when you look at the neuroscience and goes, what are the kind of things that make our reaction times longer? Well, what you've got the typical kind of stuff. It's impatience, right? You've got fatigue, you've got complacent. Now, The other thing that's kind of interesting, and this was something that was done in the 2020s, they kind of like did some research, and what they found was that people in general, right, tend to think that when you stop using the phone on the road, for instance, as soon as you stop using the phone, your reaction time goes back. So when you're using the phone, it doubles reaction time. So reaction time when you're just driving, something happens in front of you, it takes 0.4 seconds to step on the brakes, right? If you're on the phone, even chit-chatting, it takes a minimum of 0.8 seconds, doubles reaction time, right? And this is the interesting bit that I found, is that people think that as soon as they put the phone down, they go back to 0.4 seconds. Takes 30 seconds, right? Why? Because your brain is really good at having one neural circuit working at a time. When you're driving and you're talking on the phone, there are two neural circuits driving.
Yeah.
So what happens is, because we're social beings and we're wired to be, socially polite, we give more attention to the conversation than we actually do to the driving. So the reaction time just gets lower. Like, it doesn't disappear, right? But it just gets slower. So your mistake rate goes up, right? And your inattention goes up. And people think that it's instantaneous, but it takes time for the brain to shut down one of the neural circuits and get the other one to go at full speed. Right. So sometimes accidents happen, and somebody will ask you, "Were you on your phone?" And people go, "No, I was paying attention." But they were on the phone 15 seconds ago, so they were probably at 0.6 seconds rather than 0.4 seconds. So we're kind of beginning to understand the impact that some of the things that we do have. And if you think about the brain and how it functions, essentially, the brain predicts what it allows you to do based on the outcomes of previous experiences. So if you've driven and spoken on the phone and nothing bad's ever happened to you, you tend to think that there's nothing different. Your brain allows you to happen, right? Because I'm not sure if you've ever heard this one, but most people change things when life teaches them a lesson through what?
Injury.
Yeah, pain, right?
Pain, yeah.
Right? So people don't tend to change unless there is pain involved, because that's the way the brain is wired. I mean, the brain that we've got hasn't changed in 100,000 years. Right? 100,000 years, there were no cars, there were no mobiles, there was nothing that we've got here today. What was the brain concerned with? It was concerned about, I need to eat something that's not going to poison me, right? So if I've eaten it before and I'm still here, that's a good thing, right? I can't go somewhere where something's going to eat me, right? So, back 100,000 years ago, go, well, let's take a look at what's on the other side of the hill. It was a bad idea. The people that did that, a good deal of them kind of got eaten and never passed on their genes. So, that's how we've landed with the functionality that the brain has. And the brain functionality that we have is part of our biology, and we cannot compensate for it by doing things from the outside in.
Yeah, exactly. There's a saying that I absolutely adore, and it's always ensure that you chase change. Don't let change chase you, because essentially that means if change is chasing you, it means that you've got no other choice. Whereas if you're chasing the change, you're actively and you're proactively doing things to better your life. And I think that's so important and goes with what you're saying. I guess another question I wanted to sort of steer you in the direction of is, so many people, especially in the safety ecosystem, often get stuck on thinking information alone is enough to keep people safe, but that's not the case, is it?
No, because look, what I think that's been one of the things that have sort of stopped us from sort of moving a little bit forward with safety, is that the problem is that we tend to think that we're conscious, we're rational beings. But the evidence from a neuroscience perspective is that most of the activity in our brain is not in the prefrontal cortex. So knowing is good, but people tend to think that if they know, then they will make the right decisions not to get injured. Yeah. But that's not how the brain works. What the brain does is it really uses the outcomes of our experiences in order to determine what is safe and what isn't. And it's actually not really about safety for the brain. It's about what is certain, what is uncertain. The brain tries to get away from being uncertain. Right? So, going and have a look what's on the other side of the hill is uncertain. So the brain goes, no, that's not a good idea. Whereas eating the banana that you got out of the tree that you've eaten 20 times before is something certain. Right? So it tends to favour the things based on outcome.
And how would you help workers get a more complete understanding on what drives them to do what they do and make things more certain?
Yeah. So what we do is we help them. So the biggest obstacle that we find with workers is they think that inattention is only ever in play when people get injured.
Yeah.
Right? But inattention is in play anytime something familiar, right? So when you see people walking on and looking at the mobile phone, their attention is on the mobile phone. Their attention is not on what can potentially hurt me. I have seen people look at the mobile phone while they're crossing the road, pedestrian crossing, green man, all that kind of stuff. I mean, to the point where we taught our children when they were young, what we said to them is that rather than say, listen, look both ways before you cross the road, we actually went one step further. And what we taught them is that I don't care what the lollipop lady told you to do. I don't care whether there's a zebra crossing, a green man telling you, or what your friends are doing. You look both ways before you cross the road, and you keep looking while you're crossing. Why did we do that? Is because we want them to see what can potentially hurt them as early as possible, because that gives them the chance of getting out of the way, right?
Take the blinkers off and
Yes, but what do most people do? The green man the red man turns to green.
Oh,
and
he told me it was safe. I'm going. I don't need to worry. The green light told me it was okay. Right. Yeah.
And that is a mental shift from being right to being safe. Right? Because if you just follow the green man and you're relying on the green man, that is being right. Right? What we're interested in is getting people to understand that being right does not equal being safe. So I'm not a lawyer. I don't care who's to blame. I don't work for an insurance company. I don't care who pays. My only focus is how do I teach people to prevent incidents? Because even if somebody else pays or somebody else is to blame, if you get hit by a car, you're going to be the one feeling the pain. So that's the whole thing that we try and get people to do. So the first thing we get them to do is we get them to see how much inattention is part of everything they do.
So that'd be eye-opening for a lot of people, wouldn't it?
Well, yeah, right. And it's kind of interesting because even though we say to people, I want you to look for the subconscious brain modes, impatient, fatigue, and complacent, and I ask them, I go, does there has to be an incident in order for any of those three to be in play? And they'll go, no, right? So we give them little cards as prompting devices, getting them to fill that stuff out. And then we come back and we go, Freddie in the corner, he goes, oh, I didn't see any. And I go, what do you mean you didn't see any? And I said, well, nothing happened in front of me, right? So even though we kind of go out of our way to point it out, people go back to what they feel comfortable with and what they know. And sometimes they don't really fully appreciate what we need them to do. So we don't just provide training for the worker, for everybody on the site. We also need to get leadership to do certain things.
That was my next question, is not only how do we help the workers, but oftentimes we find that it's the workers that are voicing the issues and the leaders aren't necessarily aware, or the leaders aren't aware of how to get a better understanding of what drives themselves and what drives their team, and how do you help them as well?
Yeah. So I'll give you an example. We always start all our implementations by doing a one-day session with leadership, right?
Right.
And essentially, it's to get them to understand that if they want to improve safety, they can only land on four things. They can either eliminate the hazard, provide a better control, talk to them about the importance of safety, hoping that safety will be front of mind whenever it is that they're doing whatever it is that they're doing, or they need to understand the subconscious brain modes and control them better, right?
Yeah.
The biggest problem we have with leadership is that they're stuck on knowledge and conscious control, right? And when we ask them, why is that? Well, it's because it's seductive. That's how it feels. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that they're related to their own experiences. So let me give you an example. I'm talking to an executive leader, and this company sort of assembles things, right? And one of the last incidents is somebody drilled a hole through their hand. And he looked at me and he said, well, why is it that the person has done that? Right? When I go home and I use the drill, right, I'm always thinking about where my hands are, and I've never had an incident with any of my hands. And I said to him, well, what brain mode are you in? Because he doesn't do it very often. He does it once every year, if that. So he's got conscious control, right? The person that had the incident at work, he's drilling day in, day out, every day. He's not got conscious control as the brain mode. He's got autopilot and complacency, right?
Yeah.
So what happens sometimes, and one of the things that we need to get leadership to understand, is that relating it to your own experiences. So just because the activity is the same doesn't necessarily mean that the same brain mode was in play. You've got to look at it from the other person's perspective, right? We look through their eyes. We've also got to think how their brains is thinking, not how ours is thinking, right? So what we find with leadership is that it takes them a while to get into the looking at it from their perspective kind of thing. But if they don't do that, then they always come back to three things: eliminate the hazard, provide better controls, or talk to them about safety. And
Exactly.
we know that is not everything there is.
And if they're not changing their mindset, nothing changes.
Yep. So what we do, and this is quite interesting, we're interested in giving the person, whether it's a worker or a leader, a way to think about what they do that's different, right? And that's the subconscious brain modes.
Yeah.
So sometimes we get workers that go, oh, but these people here, they don't do this or they don't do that or whatever. And I say, but look, at the end of the day, is this going to be good for you just at work, or is it going to be good for you 24/7? And they go, it's going to be good for me 24/7. I go, well, then it doesn't matter what your leadership do. You can get something out of this if you want to. Right? Now, if whenever you come to work, there's a supportive environment, and that helps you, with the things that you're trying to work with, you're going to get better faster. But at the end of the day, you can get something out of this, even if the whole world's against you, because what we're talking about here happens in your head, and you've got full control over what happens in your head. So one of the things that they need to, they go, oh, but, it doesn't seem like what you're telling me is that I don't have free will. And I go, well, no, you do have free will. But what happens is that there's these algorithms in your head that make you do things in the moment based on what's in front of you. And your brain's asking, what does this look like the most? And that's the neural network we're going to get to deal with it, right? Where you have free will is that you get the freedom to program that differently if you want to. And that's really what we do. We give people the opportunity and the skills and the recipe in order to program these neural networks in your head differently. So what kind of things do we do? Is that for impatient, it's the kind of thing that you feel. So if you recognize it, you can make yourself slow down or calm down, right? But that takes practice. For fatigue, it's the kind of thing that if you wait until you're tired, your brain is mush, so you're going to make a bad decision. So we teach people what the early warning signs of fatigue are, and we get them to make a decision about how to deal with fatigue earlier, right? Because your brain's going to be working better then. And for complacency, it's the kind of thing that you don't feel. Some people can, from time to time, they will register that they're complacent, but it's not very reliable. So we've identified 4 habits, 2 main ones and 2 minor ones, that will prevent most incidents. And this is not rocket science, right? No. It's kind of look before you move, right? Look for the line of fire. They're the 2 main ones, right? But telling people to do that is different than getting them to do it, right? So what we're good at, and what the whole of HabitSafe is about, is providing the whole process of how do you get people to be better at these things, because the knowledge in itself isn't enough.
No,
Like
that's right.
we have little cards, right? And I remember going to a mining conference, and I don't know if this is anything about mining or not, but overnight, everything from that we had on our desk disappeared. if it's not nailed down, it just went, right? And so a couple of years later, I hear about, oh yeah, we've tried that with ours, and nothing worked. It didn't work. And I said, so I own the company, right? So I know who my clients are. And I go, who do you work for? And he said, somebody or other. And I went, never done the program with you guys. And he said, no, we just handed cards. Right? So they've given people the knowledge, right? But they haven't actually, the knowledge is the what. Whether this works or not is very much about the how.
Yeah, so basically they had the initial point of things, but they didn't have the tools to influence.
Correct. So what does HabitSafe bring to the table? It's the how. And in order to get good at the how, you have to understand how the brain works. Because if you don't understand how the brain works, you can't get people to do the things you need them to do. Right? So that's really our speciality. Right? And that's really what people pay us for.
And do you use the same tools to influence the conscious mind as well as the subconscious?
No. So the people try to, right? But what we have found is that dealing with the subconscious is a totally different beast. So for the conscious mind, you can lay out a rational argument of why it's a good idea to do something, right? With the subconscious, the problem with the subconscious is that it doesn't work on rational. It works on experience, right? So it's about getting people to do the repetition. So what we say to people, and this is it's called Hebb's law. Hebb's law was Hebb was a neuroscientist that won a Nobel Prize for this. But what he found is that neurons that fire together wire together, right? That's the thing about repetition. So what we use is what you repeat, you get to keep. Right? But there's a downside to that, because the more we do for them, the less they do for themselves. Right? That's part of the human condition. Right?
I was going to say that can go towards good and bad habits. Like It's not necessary. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword. So if you only do things around the person, right, what you're enticing them to do is to pay less attention to things that can hurt them, because everybody's doing it, right? So I hike a lot, and I can tell within the first 2 minutes whether somebody hikes frequently or not, because they don't look at the ground. People that have spent most of their times in the mall don't look at the ground, because at the mall there's nothing you can trip on. People that hike, you can see their eyes, they're looking at where they're stepping.
They're being attentive, they're looking everywhere, they're conscious.
Exactly, right? So when it comes to attention, there's two types of attention. There's top-down attention, which is the attention that most people think they have. That's the only one that they have. But the majority of our attention is actually bottom-up, and it's tied to our habits. So if I'm really good at looking before I step, that's bottom-up attention at work. I don't have to consciously think about it. I do it automatically. And most of our attention tends to be bottom-up. And again, in safety, we pay absolutely no attention to that at all. We tend to think everything is top-down. So you can choose what you pay attention to. And there's now some neuroscience that seems to suggest that what top-down attention you have is determined subconsciously.
Why do you think that all of the discoveries with neuroscience and all the research and everything is often ignored by people in the safety realm? Like, why are we ignoring it, and why aren't we taking this more seriously?
Well, the thing is that with safety, I think, is that we have a history of going with what tends to make intuitive sense, right?
Right.
And for a long time, we've had a view of the outside in. So if you want to get the person to be safer, you talk to them about science, about safety, because safety is important, and whatever's important, you should be able to keep front of mind. Now, unfortunately, that's not the way it works, and there's plenty of neuroscience to demonstrate that. What we are finding with neuroscience is that the way the brain works is more counterintuitive than intuitive. So it's actually, I guess, what's the word? It challenges people's view of what makes someone behave safely.
It requires more effort too, and nobody has time for effort anymore, do they?
Well, yeah, but we talk to people, and you say to people, well, you got to choose your hard, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
You can either keep eating, so to stop eating the donuts today is hard. Living with obesity, living with obesity is harder. Choose your hard, right?
Exactly.
People sometimes want to go easy, right? And if they want to go easy, then changing habits and the stuff that HabitSafe does is not the best approach. It's effective if you put the time in and you get people to do it, and it's not that difficult to do, and it's really not that hard. But it's much easier to do the kind of things we've also always done for safety, which is do things around the person or talk to them about how important safety is.
Well, operating in a subconscious way and an inattentive way requires, to me, a lot less effort and a lot less thinking. Well, zero thinking, really. And obviously, the majority of people are going to choose that path. Not everyone is wired to pick the hard way, are they? Yeah.
No.
So it takes someone, I guess, and I guess this is how it leads back to safety, is nobody will chase change unless it chases them, and they inflict pain, or they have pain inflicted upon themselves. And so it won't be until that point where they go, shit, I need to change something here. What can we do to rewire our brain to avoid ending up in this situation again?
Yeah, and that's the way that most people change. So what we do is we say to ourselves, look, the good news is that we do this at work, right? At work, safety is a condition of employment. HabitSafe is a safety program. So it's not really about choice. We can get them to do the practice at work. So that's kind of the way in which this kind of comes out, if you like. So, but in order to do that, the leadership, and more particularly the front line supervisor, needs to be engaged in the process. They need to understand how to influence the subconscious, and they need to be able to do it consistently, right? So what we find is that sometimes people will go through the effort of doing the training, but what they won't do is they won't do the maintenance activities, the sustainability activities. And the kind of stuff that we're sort of get people to do, it doesn't take a lot of time, it doesn't take a lot of effort, but it does need to be done consistently.
I was going to say, it requires that ongoing work. It requires ongoing ability to keep up with it and stay compliant and stay consistent.
Yeah, and look, and a good deal of this stuff is that because we allow this to go home, so you can take it home and teach it to your kids. Like a third of people will do that. There are things that people will do for their kids that they won't do for themselves.
Yeah.
Right? So a third of the people tend to be proactive enough in order to get something out of it. And then there's the 1 or 2% down the other end that don't want to do anything different. They want to be a victim, right? So, the duty of care is with the employer. It's not with me. I'm not going to do anything different, right? Then it becomes the battle is the people in between. How many of those can you get to join the proactives?
To shift, yeah.
And you get to about 60%, and then you get to critical point, and then everybody else that wasn't sure kind of shifts. That's what we have seen. And the 1% that doesn't want to do anything, they tend to end up going somewhere else, is my experience. They don't get fired or anything, but they go, I don't want to do this. I just want to fill in a bit of paper, whatever it is. And it sort of, it doesn't suit me, so I'm just going to go and work somewhere else.
Yeah, wow. I'm conscious of time. So if anybody has any questions that they would like to throw over to Cristian, please pop them in the Q&A box or the chat box now. And while you guys are doing that, I'm going to ask you one final question. If I was to come to you and ask, what would be your 3 to 5 top tips on how to create a safer working environment or a safer workplace in either the leadership viewpoint or in the viewpoint of a worker, what would be your 3 or 5 top tips in a neuroscience, from a neuroscience point of view?
From a neuroscience point of view. So first and foremost, they need to know, they need to understand that inattention is not just involved in incidents. Most inattention is involved when nothing happens, when there is no incident. So people need to understand that. They also need to understand what the main causes of inattention are, which is really sort of impatient, or if you like, rushing or frustration, fatigue and complacency. And we need to understand to what degree people do things in autopilot. So when you think about, what are the brain modes that drive most of our behaviour? It's either conscious control, autopilot, impatience, or fatigue. So if you look at autopilot, if you have habits that are attentive, people say, oh, you're situationally aware, you're competent, sometimes people say. If you have habits that are inattentive, you tend to get complacency. So when you look at safety, if you have habits that make you attentive, and it doesn't really we don't have many of those that lead to incidents. Most of the incidents that we see are when people have habits that make them more inattentive. They don't look for the line of fire, they don't look before they move. It's that kind of stuff that leads to incidents, right? So they need to go through that process and understand, and then really it's about practicing the techniques in a way that they do it consistently. By far, the most important thing is consistency. So you can set. Even the interesting thing about this is that people use the techniques that we teach them, like how to change habits, for other things. Right? You want to lose weight, you want to stop looking at TikTok, I don't know, whatever it is, it's the same process. But it's not the same recipe for everyone, because we're all individual, we're all wired differently, so different things work for each of us. So what we do is we basically say to them, these are the kind of prompts that you can use, these are the kind of things that you need to experiment with, try it for a week, see how it goes. If that's not giving you the results that you want, come back, and what we'll do is we'll help you develop a new plan. So the idea here is to match the plan that they end up with to the way in which they're wired.
I was going to say to the individual and how they work. Yeah.
So we all have the same brain, all the bits and pieces, but we're all wired differently because we've had different experiences.
Exactly.
So if you're going to change something, what's going to be most effective for you may be different than the way that I do it, right? So what do? We get people to stand up and share what works for them. Because if I'm struggling and I don't know what works for me, and I haven't tried what you've done, I go, oh, maybe the way that Christina does it is something that could potentially help me, right?
Yeah.
So we give them a boundary, we give them the kind of things they need to consider, and then they get to design their own plan.
I was going to say, you help them to understand the way that they operate on a more deeper level.
Yeah, and look, and we've sort of come back, and people have said that they've used this kind of process for all sorts of things.
I was going to say it could literally sit in any pillar of life. It doesn't necessarily have to be on a safety viewpoint. It could be in your work. It could be with your family. It could be with relationships. It could be anything. It's just a matter of molding it to that situation.
Yeah, and the relationship is one that comes up fairly often. I scream less at my partner now than what I used to.
Yeah.
Right?
Being a lot more self-aware.
Exactly. It's not that I don't scream at them, but I scream at them as less things these days. Right? So like I said to you before, my interest is why do people do what they do, and give them the tools in order for them. Like safety is like the vehicle, right?
Yeah.
If we can't engage them on safety, I don't know what else we're going to engage them on. So at work anyway. So, once they have an idea of how this works, I mean, if they want to roll it out to anything else, I mean, to other parts of their life or to people that they care.
Leanne, I'm sorry, Leanne, if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, but just exactly going back to what we're talking about, can we use this practice to minimize bullying and harassment? And I absolutely think you would be able to. What do you think?
All right. So what I think is that the people that bully and harass have a neural circuit that makes them do that. So what we teach is how do you change neural circuits? Now, it's not the kind of thing that I do. Like I can't comment on it, but you can change anything about what you do that's been wired in.
Excuse me. Even if you can't change the bully or the person that is doing the harassing, you could potentially rewire your neural pathways in your brain to handle the situation in a different manner, though, couldn't you?
Well, so salami sandwiches in my youth.
Exactly. So I think, yeah.
Yeah, and this is the whole thing about what we do. If you can't always control what's going on around you. And you can ask the bully not to bully, right? But bullies tend to be bullies. So if they want to be less of a bully, they can certainly do something about it. But if you can't do anything about the fact that that's what they're doing, is there anything that you can do inside your head that will make it more bearable? It's never pleasant, right? But
exactly. But often I think, especially when it comes to bullying and harassment, I think oftentimes it's understanding that 9 times out of 10 it's not you, it's what they're going through that's the issue, and understanding that you might not be the reason or the actual result of why they are doing the bullying. You're just the one that's copying it.
Yeah,
there's a lot more going on.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing. If they need to bully them, there's something going on, right?
That's right.
You're not privy to.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that's about it. There's no more questions. Thank you so much, Cristian. I absolutely adore talking to you and diving into everything that is neuroscience and learning all about this. I think it's fascinating, and I think we all need to work on it a little bit more and understand it more and take it into our workplaces. Your website, habitsafe.com, is it just .com or .com.au?
.com.au.
Yep.
And there is that in anything that they can sort of email me.
Exactly. I was going to say there's so many resources on his website, as well as your book. And there's just a wealth of information on there. So I encourage everybody to visit Cristian's website, habitsafe.com.au. I will, like I said, we've been recording this webinar and we will send it out with information and links to the website and a podcast and a YouTube channels and all of that sort of stuff, along with this recording. So you can look back at this at any time. And like Cristian said, if you have any questions, please reach out to him or myself and I can forward them on to him. But yeah, again, thank you so much, Cristian. You're wonderful.
Pleasure, Christina. Thank you very much for having me.
All right, everybody, have a wonderful rest of the week and we'll chat to you again soon. Bye.